Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. I'm your host, Killian, managing editor for the Being Libertarian family of publications, which includes beinglibertarian.com, think-liberty.com, rationalstandard.com, and Champion Books, which does have our inaugural book out, Igniting Liberty, Voices for Freedom Around the World. It's a great read, both if you're a seasoned libertarian or if you're just getting into the ideas. If you haven't picked up a copy yet, I do recommend it. You can follow us on all forms of social media. You can follow myself directly on Facebook by searching Killian Hobbs Author. And you can get your podcasts, you can get our podcasts. I do this every time where I say you can get your podcasts where you get your podcasts, which is such a pointless tautology. But anyway, you can get our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts, including all the other shows that are on the Think Liberty Network. If you just so happen to be tuning in for the first time, and this just happens to be the first show that you come across, there are quite a few other podcasts that are available on the Think Liberty Network, which include Amagi, Political Circus, Liberty Bites, which are nice short little episodes, maybe 5 to 10 minutes apiece. Some really good content squeezed into that smaller time frame. And, of course, the flagship podcast, which is the Think Liberty podcast, which this week, if you haven't had the chance to listen to yet, as of last week, Vinnie Marshall, who had been running it up until that time, has actually stepped down from the position of running that particular podcast. He's going in a slightly different direction. He's still part of the whole family we got here, but he is starting a solo show and is going to be putting a lot of his time and effort into that. So his longtime co-host, Caitlin Cullen, has taken over the show. It will continue. There's definitely going to still be great content going on. It's just that Vinny's not going to be as much of a regular on that particular show, since he's going to be hosting his own series, which is coming soon. So definitely keep an eye out for that. One other thing I did want to mention is the fact that you may or may not have noticed at the beginning there that I kind of paused a little bit when I was going into things. Reason for that is that quite often I say the phrase, as always, before I lead into things like, as always, you can listen to our podcasts. As always, you can follow us on social media. And one particular fan pointed out that I have a habit of doing that. It's kind of a weird verbal tick, I guess you could say. So I am going to try to make a conscious point of avoiding that throughout the course of this episode, and hopefully future episodes as well. I do take any type of criticism or ideas or suggestions that any fans of the show or fans of the articles have, if they do send it to me directly. That way I can kind of talk to them and see what their views are on things. So, as I mentioned before, you can follow me directly on Facebook, and if you send the page a message, I'm really quick on responding. You would almost think that I don't have a life outside of talking to people on social media. You'd be wrong. I do have a bit of a life outside of that, but I do make a point that if someone tries to message me directly about some of my ideas or topics or things they want to discuss or different things like that, that I do make a point of trying to get back to you as soon as I can. So that's definitely a great way to get a hold of me there, if you're so interested. One last, I guess you could call it housekeeping item here, because I know it's been a few minutes and I haven't gotten quite into the episodes and the topic we're discussing today. But one thing I did want to mention, just kind of a pat on my own back sort of thing here. What I wanted to mention was back in February, I had stated that my goal for February was to try to quit smoking, and I had failed miserably. I think I mentioned this on the last episode as well, that I was still going to try, but I had failed miserably and it just didn't work the way that I wanted to, and I ended up continuing to smoke. As of the recording of this episode, I am going to be roughly, I guess it would be about 60 hours smoke-free, give or take. I finally found a method that's allowed me to switch off from actual cigarettes and lets me get away from smoking properly, I guess you could say. So that's a little pat on the back moment for myself here, and I'm kind of proud of. But I digress. That was part of the monthly challenges that I put out to everybody. So again, if you're a first-time listener and you haven't heard of the topic, basically every month you pick something new, And if it's something that you're not good at or something you have no knowledge on, something you just want to improve on, whatever else, you just devote that month's spare time towards some form of self-improvement. And you can keep going with the same thing afterwards, but the idea is to try something new out each month. And then, if something doesn't stick, you drop it. If it does stick, add that to just a regular part of your life and then still try to improve beyond that. It's helped me greatly throughout the course of my life when it comes to different pieces of knowledge I picked up or skills that I've acquired, just my ability to relate to people and even just some of the conversations I can have because I've got that, at least that layman's knowledge on topics that you may not necessarily have a reason to know anything about. But anyway, I guess with those, that lengthy bit of housekeeping out of the way at the beginning of the episode here, I'm going to get right into the topic. So the topic today that I want to discuss was UBI. So the universal benefit idea. I know that's not actually what the I in the UBI stands for, but that's just kind of what I said. Ignore me for a moment. When it comes to UBI, the reason I wanted to discuss it was because I find that quite often when the topic of UBI comes up, it's long, lengthy breakdowns of the negatives of a welfare state, the issues you run into when you are creating that kind of baseline income without a particular effort point in it, the general issues with the long-standing history of redistributionism that we see in a lot of Western countries where the rich are semi-punished for being rich and larger portions of their income are brought down, which sounds great on paper, but then you look at how that goes through the total costs of our products, in which case that baseline becomes effectively useless. You see that in the minimum wage argument a lot as well. But you see, when it comes to the topic of UBI or freedom dividends, I guess you could call it as Andrew Yang wants to call it, I find there's a very interesting aspect that seems to be ignored. And what I'm referring to is the long-term impact that a UBI could end up playing on society. So, let's take our libertarian hats off for a moment and instead try to tackle this just looking at the potential impact it could have. So I'm not going to, dive into how welfare programs in general require taxation and the problems with the taxation-based system. I'm not going to, dive into how we feel about it or some of the issues with just Keynesian argumentation in general when it comes to economics, especially some of the neo-Keynesian stuff that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I'm not going to get into that part. Instead, what I want to look at is how certain aspects of the UBI argument will play out. So, this is going to be a hypothetical, of course. I'm just going to use different pieces of information I have here and try to paint a picture where I could see this going. Now, one thing I do need to highlight before we get into this, because I'm going to say some things that may end up looking positive when it comes to the concept of UBI. We need to understand that if we replaced the term welfare with the term community fund or some other similar system, you could have a voluntary system at a local level that allows people to have this kind of, I guess you could say, baseline sustenance. We don't have to specifically have a UBI for a UBI idea to play out. So with that in mind, first and foremost, I want to go through some of the arguments. So one of the more common arguments in support of UBI is the fear of automation. So this comes up because people feel that certain jobs are continuously being replaced by more and more advanced robotics and AI systems, that many jobs are just going to completely disappear. Now, this is technically true, but I'll explain why it is and isn't in just a sec. Because historically, it's not really the case. What usually happens with automation, or, you could say immigration or jobs going overseas or anything like that, any of the standard things we hear that make it say, oh, the jobs are all disappearing. Well, not exactly. In reality, these things generally lead to more jobs existing. So let's just an example I like using is the old-fashioned lamp lighters. So these are the people that would go around and would light the candles that made up the streetlights. The argument could be made that with the founding of oil lamps, the candle makers lost a lot of business and lost some jobs. And then with the coming of electricity, the lamplighters lost their jobs because the lights became automatic. Instead, this blew up into a completely new type of industry. And this resulted in tons of jobs being created for the glass blowers, for making the filaments, for making the electrical systems, the actual people who do the work maintaining them, improving on them, so on and so forth, right? And there are so many jobs that came out of it that the one guy that no longer has to go around each night turning them on was really a small loss of one particular type of job compared to the total gain of what's effectively become an entire new industry. Now, these jobs are generally more specified and require a higher level of skill than the jobs that preceded it that were automated out. But again, we can go into that topic, but we see just in general society, like right now, most jobs require a minimum level of understanding when it comes to computer systems that 30, 40 years ago would have been considered almost advanced knowledge. So even though these things are getting more specified, as time progresses and that becomes our baseline, that type of skill will become our baseline when we're looking at this. So let's switch it over for a sec. A common argument against UBI is that it will lead to people no longer desiring work. So effectively, the idea here is that our basic survival needs met means we won't pursue labor any further as it will be unnecessary. I kind of get this argument. Why work if everything is covered, right? Why would you put in the extra effort if everything that you need to survive is already taken care of? Well, personally, I disagree with this notion. And I think that the stuff that we do, like with the Being Libertarian LLC, I think is a great example. In the course of a week, we get tons, and I do mean tons, of guest submissions. We have people who go out and they write all of these different well-cited, well-crafted articles. Some of them aren't the best, but that's neither beside the point. The majority of what comes in the course of a week is usually very well written. This is almost, I would say, professional grade writing that comes through our doors, and people submit it for free. We don't pay guest writers to put a submission through. It's just they have something to say. They send it to us. And if we think that, this is really good content, then we can go ahead and publish it. These people are working not because they're looking for a specific financial reward. They're working because it's something that they wanted to put their efforts into. It's something they wanted to labor on. So I think right there, that's a perfect example of people being willing to work at something for free because the reward that they're getting out of it is something that's not financially tangible. Volunteering work is a great example of that as well. I think the volunteering industry is valued at something like $3 or $4 billion. And that's just in North America. That's the value of volunteering. If you were to take the type of jobs that were done and you actually had to pay people to do those. So you can reward people in ways that are not financial. So I don't think that eliminating that financial requirement is necessarily going to eliminate people's desire to work. The key bit, and this is something that, UBI proponents will note, is that people will pursue their own desires and passions. Now, both sides see this a little differently. The pro-UBI people will see this as a positive because it means that we're getting out of quote unquote wage slavery or other negative aspects that are associated with regular employment. And instead, we're working towards something more fulfilling. On the flip side, when you have people who are against UBI, you usually see this being seen as people are all going to want to run off and become the next, big poet or become a musician, and they're not going to contribute anything that actually has a tangible value. It's going to be something that's just they're pursuing their own craft, and they may or may not get better at it, but they're just going to keep doing it and will be inundated with people who want to be the town poet. And, there's value to both views of this. I guess it really depends on your worldview on it. But, the way we're going to take this a little bit further into the future here. So instead of, having a person who's slaving away over a grill at the local McDonald's. You can let Flippy, the burger flipping robot, which, by the way, is an actual thing. There's a business, I think it's called Cali Burger. There's about 60 locations, and they have an AI-driven burger flipper. So it's not just the self-serve kiosks that are coming. It's actually the actual cooking that is starting to be replaced with these robotics, which I think is absolutely fascinating that that's becoming an industry. But anyway, you can let Flippy take care of those types of jobs, and you could use the UBI to put your energies towards your passions, which in turn should, I do say should, lead to better levels of productivity. At least that's where the theory goes. Again, like I said, whether I agree with it, disagree with it, there's a lot of things that I find negative about the concept of UBI, and I think that it could go south really quick, especially when we look at how forced minimum wage increases have affected the overall economy, and how we look at even just the general increases to the welfare state that we have has affected society. But again, we're working off of a hypothetical where these things actually just work out. So do bear with me when I'm going through this idea. So the mechanics of funding it aside, I could see the reason for supporting this kind of labor model in society. So, but we do need to look at the funding aspect a little first here. So let's say, since it's popular in the news, we'll use Yang's $1,000 a month. We can see that it'll be a nice supplement to people's regular income, but that fails to solve anything when we see the, value-added taxes that he wants to use, which is going to increase the cost of every product at every stage in its manufacturing, from raw material all the way through the various processes it has to go through, right up until it hits the shelves. There's going to be an additional tax at every stage. There's other methods of accruing these taxes to pay for, well, I don't want to piss off the MMT crowd, but to offset the cost of a UBI that is going to be moved over to the general public through these various tax hikes. So sure, you get that extra $1,000, but now everything costs triple. So what did you really gain? Nothing. When we account for this supposedly countering unemployment in the future, that just means less people paying taxes in general. There's going to be more people renting, so they're not necessarily paying property taxes. There's going to be far less people employed, which means that a large quantity of income tax is just going to be gone because there's people just not employed in those jobs anymore paying that income tax. So the burden becomes more concentrated, and the notion of money trading hands, if it's just going to go government to person, person to business, business to government in that kind of rotating juggler's triangle, then the actual notion of money trading hands becomes artificial at best. This also doesn't deliver on the promise of freeing people from unpreferable labor, since that $1,000 wouldn't be enough to cover costs on its own. A perfect quote-unquote UBI should be able to cover rent, food, basic clothing, heat and hydro, pretty much anything that's not a luxury, anything that is what we would consider to be a staple of existence now. So, the $1,000 Yang Buck form of UBI, it's catchy as a marketing slogan, and it poses its own economic problems, considering that traditional welfare isn't going away in its place. But when we think of the purpose of a UBI for covering the costs of living, we need to take our thought experiment outward. So, let's assume, for argument's sake, we've reached a point where the bulk of unlikable jobs, so I'm talking about the Walmart greeter type jobs, or the job at the grill that was just replaced by Flippy, these jobs are covered via automation, or for the ones that can, they've been outsourced to other countries. So now we have to have a high enough of a base UBI to cover the needs of everyone. So what happens there? Well, to start, people won't be able to simply jump into high-end positions or become masters of the craft overnight. We know people are going to pursue their own passions, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be good at it, let alone good enough that the businesses that are operating all of these various technological marvels that have made our lives that much easier, apparently, it doesn't mean that they're going to be good enough to jump right into that. So more time to pursue it will mean that they end up honing those skills, but it doesn't mean they're going to be near the top of the chain, especially with other people having the exact same time, because everybody's supposed to have the exact same UBI. So what I see happening here is that unless newer fields emerge that are of interest to people, since in this scenario, there's enough of the UBI to cover everyone's base costs, and people don't really need to work in this sense unless they're working for the sake of a luxury they desire. And assuming this somehow doesn't turn into some form of, Star Trek socialism where they just decide to toss the concept of money aside. Assuming that, I believe that in this theoretical world, we would move from our current service economy into more of an, I guess you could say, an entertainment economy. So, I'll use Think Liberty, Being Libertarian, the whole family of stuff we do here. I'll use that as an example again. I think that if we reach that kind of point where menial labor is dealt with and, it's just unavailable as a way to earn an income, you can't just go apply to do some generic floor sweeping job because there's a robot doing it and it's just not even an option for employment anymore. I think that that'll leave people who are looking for funds for these luxuries not covered by the UBI system, or just something fruitful to do with their day, away from maybe another Netflix marathon that lasts 16 hours, if that's all people have left. And we're actually taking the idea that people are going to be that lazy, which I don't think that they actually will. But assuming that doesn't happen and people want to create their own paths of it here, I think the only path that people can kind of just jump right into is going to be either marketing or content production. And when I say marketing is a very specialized skill. I am not going to say anything negative about people who do marketing. I've seen a lot of the work and effort that goes into that. I mean, I'm in sales myself, so I get how hard the actual back-end marketing strategies can be to execute properly, and the way that you have to read and feed that kind of data. But on the flip side of that, we've all seen people who are, selling Tupperware or Avon or essential oil packages or things like that. And I mean, anyone can jump into that sort of stuff. But a lot of people don't really buy into that. The amount of people that go into it to sell it are probably the closest to the amount of people that actually purchase it than any other industry there is. I can't name an industry outside of the self-serve, dedicated distributor type jobs. I can't name an industry where the amount of customers versus the amount of opportunities of business are so close to each other. But that's beside the point, I should say. What people do consume, though, they do look for quality, and there is a better ratio of difference as far as, just the purposes of building a business model would be, are people who consume media. So tastes for media, right? And this needs to be said before I get to the next part here. People's tastes in media are based on what the individual enjoys. So even something that someone might say is not the best content out there, well, there's definitely going to be people who go out and enjoy it. I mean, as much as we make fun of Nickelback and Imagine Dragons, people still buy those albums. They're still multimillionaires. They still continue to sell sold out shows. So even though the ongoing joke is the fact that they're terrible, well, they're obviously not terrible to everybody. And there's enough people out there that like it to make them multimillionaires for doing what they do. Always something to keep in mind when we talk about the consumption of media and people's tastes with it. Even though I think if you're a fan of either of those bands, it's kind of quotation marks around the word taste, but that's beside the point. So with some things, we have a certain level of expectation when it comes to quality. We have that general sense of it. But, as the internet's proven, especially with the original rise of YouTube before Google took it over, and even a little bit afterwards, but mainly before, we've seen that even though we have a general sense of quality expectation, when it comes to the actual taste aspect, there's no telling what's going to take off. So with the advent here of this media and entertainment-based economy, I think we'll run into a key issue that UBI can end up having in this hypothetical of ours. So just to recap so far, in our system, we have a UBI that covers all baseline non-luxury costs, and most type of service jobs and our few remaining manufacturing jobs and the like have, for the most part, either been outsourced or completely replaced with some form of automation. So keep that in mind when I say that this becomes our next hurdle. Time. Time will become the only real resource we truly need to worry about if we have a total life cost system in place. So if we have it where almost, again, like I said, everything is taken care of, then we need to look at what's going to be left. Now, I'm not going to get into the scarcity arguments because we know that there's going to be a scarcity of resources, scarcity of land, and certain markets and things like that are going to continue to exist in those realms. I'm not saying we're going to get rid of scarcity. That's just not a thing. But as far as what our economy focuses on, I believe it's going to turn into time. Because, I mean, UBI, if we try to implement any form of UBI, that's going to become the end of the road for it. Between general societal advancement, covering more of the base jobs, what would be, likely be a progressive system, it's going to reach that point where only luxuries are going to be something that you have to work for. Now, again, the whole system could collapse, and there's tons and tons and tons of counter arguments out there that explain exactly why UBI could crash. But for this hypothetical, we're trying to give it its best chance. So if we're assuming it goes through everything is covered, and it all has worked, I believe that, again, we're going to reach that media type economy where people just start creating their own content and they start putting that out there, and that's how they fulfill themselves and try to build things up. There's still going to be people who want to go and be doctors. There's still going to be people who want to be architects, and still going to be people that take the time to really study into those things and get into those fields. But for the average person that doesn't necessarily have the skills or wants to invest the time in one particular thing like that, for kind of the pick up and go at it kind of industry, I think that general open media is going to be the route that a lot of people end up taking, which in turn is going to lead to what I'm going to call the action economy. It's actually a term I pulled from, if anyone's ever played, and everyone's going to laugh at me for being a nerd on this one, but if anyone's ever played Dungeons and Dragons, it's a term that's used in their game mechanics called action economy, where you try to accomplish as much as possible inside of a single turn, and certain things that help improve the total amount of actions or things that you can accomplish inside of a single turn's worth of actions are usually considered to be of the utmost priority, because it's the only thing that you can't level up or change or simply accrue through play. So this action economy is what I'll use as the term here for our time-based economy that's going to be matching up with this media system. I think that the action economy idea is going to be the true future of any society that's gotten past the survival barrier. So even in our own economy, we see this happening with productivity focuses increasing, and most of our technology being geared towards speed and ease of completing tasks, rather than, say, higher and higher quality at the expense of precious time. We put the focus on doing it quick, doing it easy, and getting that quick satisfaction out of it to move on with something else. So we're already seeing our view on things switching towards that time focus, whereas before it used to be, it doesn't matter how much time it takes. The point is to put together something that is of quality, something that's going to last. Now we've put more of a focus on time itself, because I think we're getting closer to that kind of action economy world. So, again, keep in mind, all of this assumes that it actually works without any of the foreseen negatives that tons of economic models showcase as being a downfall for a economy that uses a UBI system. I personally don't think that UBI could work, or at least I don't think that a state mandated UBI could work. I think that if inside of a community you had a community fund where people voluntarily put in a certain amount of income in order to have it redistributed to people who are worse off. And you had a system to try to hit kind of a minimal balance point with people doing that willingly. I think that could work, or at the very least, even if it doesn't work, I think people should be free to do so, simply because it's their money, and that sounds like a voluntary system, in which case I'm in favor of pretty much any voluntary system that doesn't trounce on somebody else. But, as far as the state-enforced UBI systems, I don't think that they could realistically work, at least long-term, without doing some serious damage to the economy. But I think its implications, even and especially if somehow reached voluntarily, are worth this kind of exploration. I think this eventual future of an action-based economy, I think it's inevitable. Even with or without UBI, I think that reaching some form of action economy is going to be an inevitability. Technological advances are going to make some baseline issues regarding survival no longer an issue, like how HVAC technology increased our ability to survive in the winter. Medical advances made it so that we don't have to worry as much about death during childbirth. It's still a thing that happens, and a lot of people think that it's not really all that common of a thing. But if you compare it to, even just 100 years ago, the difference is vast in how far we've come along in keeping people alive during that process. So, I think that with technology increasing our survival rates, increasing that baseline for our existence, that's going to help in this shift towards our focus on time. And I also think that when certain things such as food becomes cheaper and easier to manufacture, especially with some of the GMO technologies that have been continuously improved on year after year after year, and we'll reach a point where worrying about survival is going to be seen almost as quaint. We're going to reach a point, we're already pretty well off. Even our worst are still pretty well off, all things considered, in Western society. When you compare it to the living conditions in a good portion of the world, even our worst are doing pretty good. And I think that it's going to continue to improve. That bottom line is going to continue to get better and better as we make these various advancements. And I think that the result of this is going to be very similar to the future that I painted, where we move from our current type of economy into more of a media economy, and it's all going to be predicated on an action economy or a time-based economy. I think that the key takeaway here is that our future is changing, just like the agriculture economy. That gave way to the manufacturing one, and that fell before our service economy that we have now, that we see predominantly in the West. We're going to witness another death of an economic system in our lifetimes. I do see the service economy model dying before we're even gray. The question isn't whether it's going to happen. The question is whether we'll see it coming. And if so, are we going to be ready for it? I hope that this idea, or at least this concept, is something that's resonated with you a little bit. Maybe it gives you an idea of thinking of the long-term impact that some of these ideas could have. And it's worth working through some of these hypotheticals to get to potential futures, because at the very least, even in the best or worst of hypotheticals on a certain topic, if you notice that the building blocks and chains all start leading towards a certain idea, then maybe that can give you a bit of an insight into what the next steps for our society might look like. That's all that I have for today's episode. If you do have any questions about any of the topics that I touched on, or any commentary you'd like to make on it, again, you can go directly to my author page on Facebook. That's just search Killian Hobbs Author and you'll find me. When you're there, you can either leave a comment if you see the post for this podcast there, or you can send me a message directly through the Facebook page. And again, I do respond as quickly as possible for those when I do see them coming. You can follow us on all forms of social media. You can get our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. You can go to the various websites that we have, And do make sure to hit the little subscribe bell for all the daily articles that come out, such as my Bad Arguments article that would have come out yesterday on think-liberty.com. And I'm not going to say the two words, but if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.